The autumn morning at Buckingham Palace carried an unusual tension that even the most experienced staff members could sense. Queen Camilla sat in the private drawing room, her hands trembling slightly as she held the official document that would change everything. The cream-colored paper bore the royal seal, and the words written in formal script seemed to blur before her eyes as she read them for the third time. King Charles had made a decision that would shock the entire royal family and send ripples through the British monarchy. After months of careful deliberation and consultation with his most trusted advisors, he had chosen to implement a new policy regarding extended family connections within the royal household. The document outlined a complete restructuring of how family ties would be managed, particularly those that extended beyond immediate royal blood relations. The policy was comprehensive and unforgiving. All family members who had married into the royal family would need to choose between maintaining their previous family connections or fully embracing their royal duties without external influences. This meant that Camilla would have to sever all formal ties with her children from her first marriage, her siblings, and extended family members, who were not directly part of the royal lineage. Charles had spent countless sleepless nights wrestling with this decision. The pressure from Parliament and various royal advisors had been mounting for months. They argued that the monarchy needed to present a more unified front, free from the complications that came with multiple family loyalties. The recent scandals involving various royal family members had made it clear that divided loyalties often led to conflicts of interest and public relations nightmares. Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles, and daughter, Laura Lopes, had built their own successful lives, but they had always maintained close relationships with their mother. Tom had established himself as a respected food writer and critic, while Laura had created a thriving art gallery business. Both had been supportive of their mother's marriage to Charles, understanding the complexities of royal life, but they had never expected to be completely cut off from formal recognition or association. The Queen Consort's sister, Annabel Elliot, who had been her closest confidant throughout their entire lives, would also fall under this new policy. Annabel had been instrumental in helping Camilla navigate the challenging early years of her relationship with Charles, providing emotional support during the most difficult periods when public opinion was firmly against her. The thought of losing this vital connection was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire situation. As Camilla continued reading, she discovered that the policy included specific provisions about communication, public appearances, and even private family gatherings. Any violation of these new guidelines would result in immediate consequences for her position within the royal family. The document made it clear that this was not a request, but a mandate that would be enforced strictly. The king's private secretary had delivered the document personally, explaining that His Majesty understood the difficulty of the situation but believed it was necessary for the future stability of the crown. Charles himself had been unable to deliver the news in person, knowing how devastating it would be for his wife. He had retreated to his study, where he remained in isolated contemplation, struggling with the weight of his decision. Camilla's mind raced through decades of memories with her family. She remembered her children's weddings, where she had stood proudly as their mother, balancing her royal duties with her maternal instincts. She thought about holidays spent at her family's country estate, where she could relax and be herself without the constant scrutiny that came with royal life. These connections had provided her with strength and grounding throughout her journey from a private citizen to queen consort. The implications extended beyond personal relationships. Her family members had built businesses and social connections that often benefited from their association with the royal family. Tom's restaurant reviews carried additional weight because of his royal connection, and Laura's gallery attracted clients who were interested in the royal family's artistic preferences. This new policy would effectively end those advantages and force her family to rebuild their public identities without any royal association. Staff members throughout the palace had noticed the unusual atmosphere. Senior courtiers moved through the corridors with grim expressions, and there was an unprecedented level of security around the king's private quarters. The household staff, many of whom had developed personal relationships with Camilla's family members over the years, sensed that something significant was happening, but remained professionally discreet about their observations. Camilla's lady-in-waiting, who had been with her for over a decade, had noticed the queen consort's increasingly pale complexion and the way her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. The loyal staff member had served the royal family long enough to recognize the signs of extreme emotional distress, but protocol prevented her from offering anything more than silent support and ensuring that Camilla's immediate needs were met. The Queen Consort's personal protection officers had also observed changes in her behavior. She had cancelled several scheduled appointments and had spent hours staring out the windows of her private apartments. Her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by a distant, almost fragile presence that concerned everyone around her. The security team maintained their professional duties while privately worrying about their charge's emotional state. As the morning progressed, Camilla found herself unable to focus on any of her scheduled activities. The document lay open on the ornate writing desk, its contents serving as a constant reminder of the impossible choice she now faced. She could either accept the terms and lose her family connections forever, or refuse and potentially face exile from the royal family and lose her position as queen consort. The palace gardens, usually a source of comfort and tranquility for Camilla, now seemed foreign and unwelcoming. She had often walked through these same paths with her grandchildren, sharing stories and creating memories that now felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The thought of never again being able to officially acknowledge these relationships filled her with a profound sense of loss that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Communication with her family had been temporarily suspended while she processed the decision, adding to her isolation. She couldn't seek advice from the people who knew her best, couldn't share her fears with her sister, and couldn't even warn her children about what was coming. This enforced silence made the situation even more unbearable, as she was trapped alone with thoughts that grew darker with each passing hour. The weight of the decision pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Every option seemed to lead to devastating consequences, either for herself or for the people she loved most. The life she had carefully built, balancing her roles as mother, sister, and royal consort, was about to be torn apart by forces beyond her control. The afternoon brought no relief to Queen Camilla's torment. She had retreated to her private sitting room, a space that had always provided comfort with its warm yellow walls and carefully chosen artwork. Today, however, even this sanctuary felt cold and unwelcoming. The official document remained on her desk, its presence dominating the room like a dark cloud that refused to lift. Camilla's thoughts turned to the conversation she would eventually need to have with her children. How could she explain that their mother, who had always been their fiercest advocate and strongest supporter, would no longer be able to publicly acknowledge their existence? Tom and Laura had stood by her through the most difficult periods of public scrutiny, defending her when newspapers printed harsh criticism, and supporting her relationship with Charles even when it meant facing their own media attention. The memories flooded back with painful clarity. She remembered Tom's graduation from Oxford, where she had sat in the audience, beaming with pride as he received his degree. Laura's first art exhibition had been a nerve-wracking affair. But Camilla had been there, offering encouragement and celebrating each sale with genuine maternal joy. These moments had defined her identity as much as any royal duty, and the thought of pretending they had never happened felt like erasing part of her soul. Her sister Annabelle's absence would create an even deeper void. The two women had shared everything throughout their lives, from childhood adventures to adult struggles. When Camilla had first begun her relationship with Charles, it was Annabelle who had provided the emotional support that made it possible to endure the harsh public judgment. Late-night phone calls, secret meetings, and carefully planned public appearances had all been orchestrated with Annabelle's help and understanding. The practical implications of the decision were becoming clearer as the day progressed. Camilla's family members would need to remove any references to their royal connections from their business materials, social media accounts, and public biographies. Years of carefully built professional relationships that had been enhanced by royal association would need to be renegotiated on entirely different terms. The financial impact alone could be devastating for some family members who had built their livelihoods around these connections. King Charles remained sequestered in his study, but reports from his private secretary indicated that he was struggling enormously with the decision he had been forced to make. The king understood better than anyone the pain this would cause his wife, but the pressure from government officials and senior royals had made it clear that the monarchy's survival depended on these difficult choices. The institution was more important than any individual, even those they loved most deeply. The palace staff had begun to notice physical changes in the queen consort's appearance. Her usually impeccable grooming seemed less careful, and she had declined assistance with her afternoon wardrobe change. The lady-in-waiting had discreetly mentioned to the senior household staff that her mistress had barely touched her lunch and had refused her usual afternoon tea. These small details painted a picture of someone whose world was collapsing around her. Camilla's grandchildren would also be affected by this decision, though they were too young to fully understand the implications. She had always been Gaga to Tom's children and Laura's daughter, a loving grandmother who attended school plays and birthday parties when her royal schedule permitted. The thought of becoming a stranger to these innocent children, who had never asked to be part of royal complications, added another layer of heartbreak to an already unbearable situation. The Queen Consort's chaplain had been summoned for what was officially described as a routine spiritual consultation, but the staff members who arranged the meeting understood its true purpose. Camilla needed guidance that went beyond protocol and politics, seeking comfort from someone who could help her navigate the moral and emotional dimensions of her impossible choice. The weight of the decision was affecting her physical health, and those closest to her were becoming increasingly concerned about her ability to cope. As evening approached, Camilla attempted to maintain some semblance of normalcy by reviewing her upcoming schedule. However, the irony of planning future engagements while contemplating the destruction of her most important relationships was not lost on her. Every charity event, every public appearance, every royal duty now felt hollow and meaningless compared to the connections she was being asked to sacrifice. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire ordeal. Camilla couldn't seek comfort from the people who loved her most, couldn't share her fears with those who understood her best, and couldn't even express her anger to those who had created this impossible situation. She was trapped in a golden cage, surrounded by luxury and privilege, but utterly alone in her anguish. The Queen Consort's evening routine, usually a calming end to busy days filled with royal obligations, became another source of distress. Her reflection in the ornate mirror seemed to belong to a stranger, someone whose life had been reduced to a series of calculated choices designed to serve an institution rather than honor personal relationships. The woman looking back at her appeared older, more fragile, and profoundly sad. Communication attempts from her family members had been intercepted by palace security, following protocols that were ostensibly designed to protect her from outside pressure during this decision-making period. However, this protection felt more like imprisonment, cutting her off from the very people whose voices she most desperately needed to hear. The silence from her children and sister was deafening, even though she knew it was artificially imposed. The emotional strain began manifesting in physical symptoms that couldn't be ignored. Camilla experienced sharp pains in her chest, difficulty breathing, and waves of nausea that left her feeling weak and disoriented. Her personal physician had been called discreetly, but medical attention could do little to address the root cause of her distress. The prescribed sedatives provided temporary relief, but couldn't heal the emotional wounds that were growing deeper with each passing hour. Sleep became impossible, as her mind raced through possible scenarios and their consequences. Each potential outcome seemed worse than the last, creating a spiral of anxiety that consumed her thoughts completely. The comfortable bed that had provided rest after countless challenging days now felt like a place of torment, where her worst fears played out in endless loops. The palace guards had been instructed to monitor the Queen Consort more closely, though they maintained professional discretion about their increased vigilance. Years of experience had taught them to recognize when members of the royal family were under extraordinary stress, and the current situation clearly qualified as a crisis that required careful attention. Their presence, while meant to be reassuring, served as a constant reminder of how serious the situation had become. Dawn was still hours away when Camilla finally acknowledged that she could no longer bear the weight of this decision alone. The combination of emotional anguish, physical symptoms, and complete isolation had pushed her beyond her limits. As she attempted to stand from her chair, the room began to spin violently, and darkness crept in from the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was reaching for the emergency call button before everything went black. The alarm that pierced through the pre-dawn silence of Buckingham Palace sent shockwaves through the entire royal household. Within seconds, the Queen Consort's personal protection officers were rushing through the corridors, their footsteps echoing off the marble floors as they responded to the emergency signal from Camilla's private quarters. The palace guards, trained for every possible scenario, mobilized with military precision, despite the chaos of the moment. When the first officer reached Camilla's sitting room, he found her collapsed on the Persian carpet, unconscious and pale as porcelain. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, and her pulse was weak but detectable. The emergency call button lay just inches from her outstretched hand, suggesting she had managed to activate it in the final moments before losing consciousness. The officer immediately called for medical assistance while his colleague checked her vital signs and began basic first aid procedures. The palace's medical team arrived within minutes, led by the royal physician who had been on standby since the previous day's consultation. As they worked to stabilize the queen consort, the gravity of the situation became clear to everyone present. This was not simply a case of exhaustion or a minor health episode, but a complete physical and emotional breakdown that had been building throughout the previous day's ordeal. King Charles was awakened by his private secretary, who delivered the news with the careful diplomacy required for such devastating circumstances. The king's immediate response was to rush to his wife's side, abandoning the isolated contemplation that had consumed him since making his impossible decision. As he knelt beside Camilla's unconscious form, the weight of his choice hit him with full force, and for the first time since becoming king, he questioned whether the monarchy was worth the price it demanded from those he loved most. The medical team worked efficiently to assess Camilla's condition, determining that she had suffered what appeared to be a severe anxiety attack, combined with physical exhaustion and dehydration. Her body had simply shut down under the enormous stress of the previous day's events, unable to process the emotional trauma any longer. While her vital signs gradually stabilized, the unconsciousness persisted, suggesting that her mind was protecting itself from further psychological damage. Word of the emergency spread quickly through the palace staff, though strict confidentiality protocols were immediately implemented to prevent any information from reaching the media. Senior household members coordinated with security teams to ensure that the situation remained completely private, while medical professionals continued their work. The last thing anyone wanted was for this personal crisis to become a public spectacle that would only add to the family's suffering. Charles remained at Camilla's bedside as the royal physician explained the medical situation. The combination of stress, sleep deprivation, and emotional trauma had created a perfect storm that overwhelmed her system. While there was no immediate danger to her life, her recovery would depend largely on resolving the underlying cause of her distress. The doctor's words carried an unspoken message that everyone in the room understood clearly. As dawn broke over London, Camilla began to regain consciousness slowly, her eyes fluttering open to find Charles holding her hand and speaking softly to her. The relief in his voice was unmistakable as he assured her that she was safe and that everything would be different from that moment forward. The decision that had seemed so important just hours earlier now appeared utterly insignificant compared to his wife's well-being and their relationship. The king's transformation was immediate and complete. He summoned his private secretary and senior advisors, informing them that the new family policy would be withdrawn indefinitely, pending a complete review of its necessity and implementation. The pressure from Parliament and other royal advisors suddenly seemed less important than preserving the relationships that gave meaning to their lives. Charles had learned that being a king meant nothing if it required destroying the people he loved most. Camilla's recovery was gradual but steady as the immediate crisis passed. The knowledge that she wouldn't be forced to choose between her royal duties and her family connections lifted an enormous weight from her shoulders, allowing her body to begin healing from the trauma of the previous day. However, the experience had fundamentally changed her perspective on the balance between personal relationships and royal obligations. The palace physician recommended a period of complete rest and recovery, during which Camilla would be excused from all royal duties and public appearances. This time would allow her to reconnect with her family members and rebuild the emotional strength that had been so severely damaged. The medical team also suggested counseling support to help process the psychological impact of the crisis and develop better coping strategies for future challenges. Tom Parker Bowles and Laura Lopes were informed of their mother's condition and immediately traveled to the palace, where they were reunited with Camilla in an emotional scene that demonstrated the strength of their family bonds. The relief and joy of the reunion helped accelerate Camilla's recovery, confirming that these relationships were indeed essential to her identity and well-being. The king welcomed his stepchildren warmly, acknowledging that he had underestimated the importance of these connections. Annabel Elliott's arrival at the palace marked another crucial milestone in Camilla's recovery. The sisters embraced with tears of relief and gratitude, both understanding how close they had come to losing their lifelong bond. Their reunion served as a powerful reminder to everyone present that some relationships transcend political considerations and institutional requirements. The king personally apologized to Annabel for the distress the proposed policy had caused. The crisis had lasting effects on the royal household's approach to family matters. New protocols were established to ensure that future policy decisions would include thorough consideration of their personal impact on family members. The king instituted regular family meetings where concerns could be discussed openly before they reached crisis proportions. These changes represented a fundamental shift in how the monarchy balanced institutional needs with human relationships. Charles also implemented changes in his own decision-making process, ensuring that he would never again be pressured into making choices that violated his core values or harmed his closest relationships. The experience had taught him that true leadership sometimes meant standing against institutional pressure when it conflicted with basic human decency and love. His advisors learned that their king would not be manipulated into sacrificing his family for political convenience. The queen consort's public return to royal duties was carefully managed to demonstrate her complete recovery, while subtly reinforcing the importance of family connections within the royal framework. Her first appearance included her children and sister, sending a clear message that these relationships were now officially recognized and valued. The public response was overwhelmingly positive, with many people expressing admiration for the royal family's commitment to maintaining personal bonds. The document that had caused so much anguish was formally withdrawn and destroyed, with new policies drafted to protect family relationships rather than threaten them. The king made it clear that future reforms would strengthen rather than weaken the personal connections that made royal life bearable. The experience had demonstrated that the monarchy's strength came from the happiness and stability of its members, not from rigid adherence to outdated protocols. Camilla's recovery became complete when she was able to resume her role as grandmother, attending her grandchildren's school events and family celebrations without fear of protocol violations. The simple joy of being Gaga again provided the final healing that medical treatment alone could never have achieved. These moments reminded everyone involved that authentic happiness was the foundation upon which all other royal duties should be built. The crisis ultimately strengthened the royal marriage and family relationships by forcing everyone involved to confront what truly mattered in their lives. Charles and Camilla emerged from the ordeal with a deeper appreciation for each other and a renewed commitment to protecting the bonds that sustained them through the challenges of royal life. The palace became a warmer, more human place where institutional requirements served the people rather than consuming them.